I want you to understand something right from the beginning. I wasn't always this person. I wasn't always the woman who would spend 2 years systematically destroying her own daughter's life, picking apart every financial thread she'd woven, every dream she'd built, until nothing remained but dust and legal documents. But when you've been cast aside like yesterday's newspaper, when your own flesh and blood looks at you with the same disgust reserved for something scraped off a shoe, will you learn that survival requires a different kind of strength? Before we go any further, I need you to do something for me. If you're finding this story compelling, if you can feel the weight of what I'm about to tell you, please hit that like button right now. Subscribe to this channel because stories like mine, stories that peel back the veneer of family loyalty and expose the raw, bleeding truth underneath, these stories need to be heard. We need witnesses to our pain, don't we? Let me take you back to where it all began, back when I still believed in the fairy tale I'd been living. 23 years of marriage to Richard Pemberton, a name that carried weight in our small, affluent community. I had married into what I thought was security, into what I believed would be a life of quiet dignity and comfortable routine. The Pemberton family had money, old money that came with expectations and unspoken rules that I spent years trying to decode. That I remember our wedding day, how his mother, Eleanor, had looked at me with those pale, calculating eyes of hers, her smile never quite reaching them as she welcomed me to the family. She had a way of making every compliment feel like criticism, every gesture of inclusion feel like charity. How lovely that Richard found someone so practical, she'd say, her voice carrying that particular brand of upper-class dismissal that cuts deeper than any outright insult. The early years were a performance, an elaborate theater where I played the role of the perfect Pemberton wife. I learned to arrange flowers just so, to plan dinner parties that impressed Richard's colleagues, to dress in a way that suggested wealth without ostentation. I became an expert at reading the room, at knowing when to speak and when to fade into the elegant wallpaper of our carefully curated life. Our daughter Sarah was born 3 years into the marriage, and for a brief, shining moment, I thought I had found my purpose, my place in the Pemberton legacy. She was beautiful, intelligent, with Richard's sharp features and what I hoped was my determination. I poured everything I had into raising her, into making sure she would never feel the subtle disapproval that seemed to follow me through every family gathering. But children grow up, and they learn to see their parents clearly, sometimes more clearly than we see ourselves. Sarah absorbed the family dynamics like a sponge, and somewhere along the way, she began to look at me the way her grandmother did, with that same cool assessment that found me wanting. By the time she was a teenager, I could see her embarrassment when I spoke too loudly at school events, her wincing when I laughed too enthusiastically at her father's jokes. Richard's business was dealing in luxury goods and specialty items that required extensive travel. At least, that's what I believed for the first 15 years of our marriage. I was the dutiful wife, managing the household, raising Sarah, maintaining the social connections that kept us anchored in our community's upper circles. I told myself that his frequent absences were the price of success, that his distraction when he was home was simply the burden of a man carrying heavy responsibilities. The first crack in my carefully constructed reality came on a Tuesday afternoon in March. I had gone to Richard's office to surprise him with lunch, something I rarely did, carrying a thermos of his favorite soup and feeling unusually domestic and loving. His secretary, Janet, had looked at me with such obvious confusion when I announced my intention to surprise my husband that I should have understood immediately. But understanding and acceptance are different things entirely. When I opened his office door and found him with Monica, his hands tangled in her dark hair, her skirt hiked up around her waist as she perched on the edge of his mahogany desk, the sound that escaped my throat wasn't quite human. It was the sound of something fundamental breaking, of a world reorganizing itself around a new, terrible truth. Richard didn't even have the decency to look ashamed. He simply straightened his tie, helped Monica smooth her skirt, and looked at me with the patience one reserves for a slow child who has interrupted something important. "Margaret," he said, my name falling from his lips like something distasteful, "we need to talk." But talking, it turned out, was really just Richard explaining the new reality to me. Monica wasn't his first affair, merely his most recent and, as he put it with brutal honesty, his most significant. He was tired, he said, tired of pretending, tired of maintaining the charade of our marriage. He wanted a divorce, and he wanted it to be civilized. For Sarah's sake, if not for mine. The next 6 months were a blur of lawyers and media. patience of dividing up a life I had thought was permanent. I discovered that Richard had been methodically moving assets, restructuring investments, preparing for this moment far longer than I had realized. What I had assumed was marital property turned out to be held in trusts and corporate structures that effectively excluded me. My comfortable future evaporated like morning mist. The house, our beautiful colonial with its perfectly landscaped gardens and rooms full of memories, went to Richard. Most of the investments were untouchable, locked away in instruments I had never understood and certainly never questioned. My settlement, generous by some standards, was a fraction of what I had believed our life was worth. I moved into a modest apartment across town, trading marble countertops for laminate, panoramic windows for views of a parking lot. But the worst betrayal was yet to come. Sarah, my daughter, my greatest achievement, chose her father's side with a decisiveness that left me reeling. She was 21 then, legally an adult but still young enough, I thought, to need her mother. Instead, she looked at me with something approaching contempt during one of our increasingly rare dinners together. "You were never really part of this family, were you?" she said, cutting into her salmon with surgical precision. "You were always just playing dress-up, pretending to belong somewhere you never fit." The words hit me like physical blows, each one carefully chosen to inflict maximum damage. She had inherited her father's business acumen and her grandmother's capacity for cruelty. It seemed, within months of the divorce, Sarah had maneuvered herself into a position at Richard's company, learning the intricacies of international trade, building relationships with clients and suppliers. She was everything I had never been: confident, competent, truly belonging to the world I had only borrowed for 23 years. The final humiliation came when I learned the truth about my bed. Not just that Richard had brought Monica to our home, to the room where I had slept beside him for over 2 decades, but that it had been happening for years. Sarah, with the casual cruelty of youth, mentioned it during what would be our last family dinner, back when she was still pretending to maintain some relationship with me. "Oh, you didn't know," she said, her eyebrows raised in mock surprise. "I thought you must have figured it out. All those business trips that weren't really business trips. All those late nights at the office. Monica's been part of Dad's life for almost 5 years now. They used your bed because hotels felt so impersonal." She delivered this news while buttering a dinner roll, as if discussing the weather. I sat there, my wineglass trembling in my hand, understanding finally that my entire adult life had been built on lies, not just Richard's lies, but my own willful blindness, my desperate need to believe in the stability I thought I had earned through compliance and performance. Every time I had changed those sheets, I had been erasing evidence of my own irrelevance. That night, alone in my apartment, I began to plan, not immediately, not with any clear vision of what I wanted to accomplish, but with a growing understanding that acceptance was not an option. I had been dismissed, discarded, treated like an inconvenient employee being let go after years of dedicated service. But I wasn't going to fade quietly into whatever diminished existence they had planned for me. I want to pause here for a moment and ask you something. Are you watching this from your bedroom, your kitchen, your office, during a lunch break? I want to know where my story is reaching you, where these words are finding you in your own life. Comment below and tell me your city and country. Tell me where you're listening to this tale of revenge and reckoning, because I want to know that my voice is traveling beyond these walls, beyond this small world where my destruction played out. The first phase of my plan was information gathering. I hired a private investigator, a woman named Patricia Chen, who specialized in corporate investigations. She was expensive, but she was thorough, and she had the kind of quiet competence that inspired confidence. What she discovered over the next 3 months changed everything. Richard's business, it turned out, was not as clean as the polished offices and expensive suits suggested. There were irregularities in import documentation, questionable relationships with suppliers in countries with flexible business practices, and a pattern of financial reporting that raised several red flags. Patricia's report was nearly 60 pages long, filled with dates, names, transaction records, and photographs that painted a picture of systematic corruption. But more importantly for my purposes, Sarah had become integral to these operations. She wasn't just Richard's daughter learning the family business. She was actively involved in the very activities that made the business vulnerable. Her signature was on dozens of documents, her approval required for transactions that skirted the edges of legality. She had made herself indispensable to an operation that was, Patricia's investigation suggested, built on a foundation of regulatory violations and tax avoidance. I spent weeks studying Patricia's report, learning the language of corporate malfeasance, understanding the connections between shell companies and offshore accounts. I educated myself in the regulatory frameworks that Richard had been circumventing, the international agreements he had been violating, the domestic tax obligations he had been avoiding. The beauty of my plan was its simplicity. I didn't need to prove criminal activity, though that might come later. I only needed to create enough regulatory scrutiny, enough official attention, to make the business toxic. Companies built on questionable practices can survive in the shadows, but they wither and die under the bright light of government investigation. My first call was to the Internal Revenue Service, to a tip line that promised anonymity and thoroughness. I provided names, dates, specific transaction details, everything Patricia had uncovered about the offshore accounts and the unreported income. I spoke in the measured tones of a concerned citizen who had stumbled across information that troubled her civic conscience. The second call went to the Department of Commerce, to investigators who specialized in import violations and trade regulation enforcement. I had documentation of shipments that had been mislabeled, of country of origin certificates that had been falsified, of goods that had entered the country without proper inspection or duty payment. The third call was the most satisfying. The Securities and Exchange Commission has investigators who focus specifically on family businesses that have grown beyond their initial oversight capabilities. I provided them with Patricia's detailed analysis of the financial reporting irregularities, the patterns that suggested systematic manipulation of earnings and expenses. But I wasn't content to simply unleash government investigators and wait for results. I began reaching out to Richard's competitors, his former business partners, anyone who might have a grudge or a competing interest. I shared information carefully, strategically, always presenting myself as someone with intimate knowledge, who was concerned about unfair competitive advantages. The first sign that my campaign was working came 3 months later, when Sarah called me for the first time in nearly a year. Her voice was tight with stress, stripped of the casual confidence that had characterized our previous conversations. "Someone is targeting the company," she said without preamble. "We're getting audits from 3 different agencies, and our biggest client just suspended their contract pending a compliance review. Do you know anything about this?" I let the silence stretch between us, savoring the sound of her worry, her need. When I finally spoke, my voice was calm, almost maternal. "Why would you think I know anything about your father's business troubles? You've made it very clear that I was never really part of the family, never understood how things worked. Mom, this isn't a game. If the company fails, if Dad gets charged with something, it affects all of us. It affects my future, my career, everything I've worked for." "Your future," I repeated slowly. "Your career, everything you've worked for. Tell me, Sarah, what exactly have you worked for? Because from where I'm sitting, it looks like you've inherited your opportunities, not earned them. Just like your father inherited his, just like his mother inherited hers." The conversation ended with her hanging up on me, but it wouldn't be our last. Over the next several months, as the regulatory pressure intensified, as clients began distancing themselves from Pemberton, as legal fees mounted and reputation crumbled, Sarah would call me repeatedly, sometimes angry, sometimes pleading, occasionally desperate enough to sound almost like the little girl I remembered. But I was past the point where her distress could move me to mercy. Every sleepless night she endured, I remembered the casual cruelty with which she had delivered the news about my bed, my marriage, my arrest. Every legal bill that arrived at their offices, I thought about the settlement that had been calculated to minimize my comfort, my security, my dignity. The regulatory investigations took on a life of their own. Once government agencies begin examining a business, they tend to be thorough. What started as inquiries about specific transactions expanded into comprehensive reviews of business practices, financial reporting, and compliance history. Richard hired expensive lawyers, specialists in white-collar defense, but their presence only amplified the sense that serious wrongdoing had occurred. Sarah's position became increasingly precarious. Her involvement in the questionable transactions, her signatures on problematic documents, made her vulnerable to both civil and criminal liability. The lawyers advised her to distance herself from the company, to cooperate fully with investigators, to consider whether her interests were truly aligned with her father's. But stepping away from the business meant stepping away from her future, her financial security, her identity as a Pemberton heir. The company wasn't just her employer, it was her inheritance, her legacy, her ticket to the life she had been raised to expect. She was trapped between legal jeopardy and financial ruin, and she began to understand, perhaps for the first time, what it felt like to have your assumed future stripped away without warning. The psychological pressure was intense. Sarah lost weight, developed a nervous habit of checking her phone constantly, waiting for calls from lawyers or investigators or clients canceling contracts. She moved back into Richard's house, ostensibly to save money, but really because she needed the comfort of familiar surroundings as her world contracted around her. Richard, meanwhile, aged years in months. The stress of multiple investigations, mounting legal fees, and shrinking business prospects took a visible toll. His hair went completely gray, his clothes hung loose on a frame that seemed to be diminishing daily, and the confident bearing that had once made him magnetic in business settings gave way to the furtive posture of a man expecting bad news. Monica, interestingly, disappeared from their lives entirely once the investigations began. The woman who had been so passionate about their future together, so committed to their relationship that she had actively participated in the destruction of his marriage, proved to have little appetite for standing by a man facing potential criminal charges. She simply stopped returning calls, stopped appearing at their usual restaurants and social events, melted back into whatever life she had been living before she became Richard's obsession. The irony was delicious. Richard had destroyed our marriage, humiliated me publicly and privately. For a woman who abandoned him the moment his prospects dimmed, he had chosen temporary passion over lasting loyalty, immediate gratification over long-term stability, and now he was facing the consequences alone, with only our resentful daughter for company. The legal proceedings stretched across 18 months, a complex dance of subpoenas and depositions, document production, and witness interviews. I watched from a distance, receiving updates from Patricia, following the public record filings that chronicled the steady dismantling of what had once been a profitable enterprise. Sarah tried to salvage what she could, working frantically to identify clients and assets that might survive the regulatory scrutiny. But it was like trying to perform surgery on a patient who was already dead. The business's reputation was too damaged, the legal costs too overwhelming, the regulatory attention too intense for any meaningful recovery. The final blow came when the IRS filed liens against both the business and personal assets, claiming unpaid taxes and penalties that exceeded the company's liquid resources. Richard was forced to declare bankruptcy, both corporate and personal, dissolving in legal documents a fortune that had taken generations to accumulate. Sarah, who had tied her identity so completely to her inheritance, to her position as a Pemberton heir, found herself facing a future dramatically different from anything she had imagined. The girl who had looked at me with such contempt, who had dismissed me as someone who never really belonged to their world, was suddenly no different from millions of other young adults trying to build careers without the safety net of family wealth. She came to see me on a gray February afternoon, sitting in my modest apartment's small living room like a refugee seeking sanctuary. She was thinner than I had ever seen her, her expensive clothes hanging loose, her confident posture replaced by the hunched shoulders of defeat. "I need help," she said, the words seeming to cost her enormous effort. "I need money, just temporarily, just until I can figure out what to do next. All our accounts are frozen, and the lawyers say the investigations could take years to resolve completely." I served her tea in my discount store cups, watching her try to adjust to the reality of reduced circumstances. "What kind of help are you looking for, exactly?" I asked, keeping my voice neutral, professional. "Alone," she said quickly. "I have some job interviews lined up, and once I get established somewhere, I'll be able to pay you back. I just need bridge financing, something to cover rent and basic expenses for a few months." "Alone," I repeated thoughtfully. "You want me to loan you money so you can maintain your lifestyle while you transition to independence. Is that correct?" She nodded eagerly, apparently missing the edge in my voice. "I know we haven't had the best relationship lately, but you're still my mother. Family helps family, right?" I stood up slowly, walking to the window that overlooked the parking lot. "Family helps family," I said softly. That's an interesting perspective. Sarah, let me ask you something. When your father was systematically hiding assets during our divorce, when he was making sure I would be left with as little as possible, did you ever suggest that family should help family? When you learned that he had been bringing his mistress to our bedroom, to the bed where I slept, did you think perhaps family should help family by giving me a warning? Her face flushed, but she pressed on. That was different. That was between you and Dad. This is about my future, my ability to build something for myself. Build something for yourself, I echoed. You mean the way you built your position at your father's company, through merit and hard work and dedication? Or do you mean the way you've built everything else in your life, by inheriting it, by assuming it was owed to you, by treating people like me as if we existed only to serve your interests? The conversation continued for another hour, her desperation growing as she realized that I was not going to provide the financial rescue she had assumed was available. She offered to sign legal documents, to pay interest, to provide collateral she didn't actually possess. She promised to rebuild our relationship, to acknowledge past mistakes, to include me in her future success. But I was done being used by people who only valued me when they needed something. I was done being the reliable, background figure who could be counted on to absorb disappointment and provide support without receiving respect or consideration in return. You know what I find most interesting about this conversation, I said as she prepared to leave, her face blotchy with unshed tears. You still don't understand what you did wrong. You still think this is about money, about business, about temporary setbacks that can be overcome with the right strategy. You don't understand that some bridges, once burned, can never be rebuilt. She left without saying goodbye, and I haven't seen her since. I heard through mutual acquaintances that she found work at a marketing firm, starting at entry level. Despite her college degree and brief experience with the family business, she moved into a shared apartment with 2 roommates, trading her car for something more economical, learning to cook her own meals and manage a budget. Richard, I learned, moved to Florida, taking a job with a former competitor who was willing to overlook his legal troubles in exchange for his industry knowledge and client relationships. He rents a modest condo, drives a used car, and has apparently given up any pretense of maintaining the lifestyle he once considered his birthright. Monica, according to Patricia's final report, married an orthopedic surgeon and moved to California. She never faced any consequences for her role in the dissolution of my marriage, never experienced any real cost for her participation in my humiliation, but she also never got to enjoy the wealthy future she thought she was securing by attaching herself to Richard. In the end, she was just another casualty of a war she'd probably never fully understood she was part of. And what about me? What did I gain from this elaborate campaign of destruction, this careful dismantling of the family that had dismissed me as irrelevant? I won, in the sense that I achieved everything I set out to accomplish. Richard's business is destroyed. Sarah's inheritance is gone. Their comfortable assumptions about their future have been shattered. They understand now what it feels like to have your life reorganized around a new, unwelcome reality. They know what it's like to discover that the foundation you thought was permanent was actually built on shifting sand. But victory, I discovered, tastes different than I expected. There's satisfaction in it. Yes, a deep sense of justice, finally served. When I see Sarah's name in the company directory at her new job, listed as a junior associate rather than an executive heir, I feel a grim pleasure. When I imagine Richard explaining to new acquaintances why he left his previous business, I smile at the awkwardness he must feel. Yet the victory is hollow in ways I didn't anticipate. I destroyed my daughter's future, yes, but in doing so I also destroyed any possibility of having a relationship with her. I proved that Richard and his family had underestimated me, but in the process I became exactly the kind of person they had always assumed I was. Bitter, vindictive, destructive. I live now in the same modest apartment, surrounded by the same discount furniture, maintaining the same reduced circumstances that launched my campaign of revenge. The difference is that now I chose these limitations, embraced them as the price of justice rather than accepting them as the consolation prize of divorce. I have no family left. No relationships that survived the years of calculating destruction I pursued with such single-minded determination. My days are quiet, orderly, filled with small pleasures and minor satisfactions. I read extensively, take long walks, maintain a small garden on my balcony. I have become someone I never intended to be, completely autonomous, entirely self-contained, responsible only to myself. Sometimes, late at night when sleep eludes me, I wonder if there was another path, another way to respond to the betrayal and humiliation that reshaped my life so completely. Could I have found a way to rebuild that didn't require destroying everyone who had hurt me? Could I have discovered a form of healing that didn't depend on ensuring others experienced equivalent pain? But those thoughts are brief, quickly dismissed. The people who loved me were supposed to protect me from unnecessary pain, and instead they were the source of my deepest wounds. The family that should have provided security and belonging instead taught me that my value was conditional, temporary, subject to revision without notice. I regret nothing, even as I acknowledge that my victory came at a cost I couldn't have fully understood when I began this campaign. I am alone now, but I am alone by choice, having eliminated the people who proved themselves unworthy of my trust and affection. I am diminished financially, but I am stronger psychologically, having learned exactly what I am capable of when pushed beyond my limits. The bed that Richard shared with Monica, the bed that represented everything false about the life I thought I was living, was sold along with all the other furniture when he declared bankruptcy. I hope whoever bought it got a good price, because it cost me 23 years of marriage and any illusions I might have harbored about the permanence of family loyalty. But I survived the destruction of that life, and I orchestrated the destruction of theirs. In the end, that has to be enough, because it's all I have left, and it's everything I fought for. Before this story fades to black, before you move on to whatever comes next in your day, I need you to do something for me one final time. If this story moved you, if you felt the weight of betrayal and the cold satisfaction of revenge, if you understand what it means to discover that the people you trusted most are capable of crushing you without a second thought, then hit that like button right now. Subscribe to this channel, because stories like this one, stories that reveal the darkness that can live inside families, inside marriages, inside the spaces where we should be safest, these stories need to be told. They need witnesses, and they need voices willing to speak the unspeakable truths about what people will do to each other when love dies and only power remains.